I feel deeply conflicted about the situation with my grandmother, who is 69, and the way she's been treating me since I announced my pregnancy. I am 25, married, and expecting twins. While my grandmother and I have always had a close relationship, she practically raised me for the first 8 years of my life. Her behavior has become more entitled, especially now that I'm about to become a mother. The dynamic between us has shifted, and I'm struggling to navigate the boundaries between her love for me and her overwhelming possessiveness toward my children. Growing up, I was her first grandchild and her undeniable favorite. I say this not to boast, but to explain the unique role I played in her life. My mom had me when she was 17, and my biological father was never in the picture. So my grandmother took on a significant role. She wasn't just my grandma. She was my caretaker, my support system, and my primary source of stability. For years, it was just me and her, and because of that bond, I think she still sees me as her baby, despite me being a grown woman. This dynamic has become increasingly uncomfortable as she fails to acknowledge the reality that I am no longer a child. For example, she continues to treat me like a little girl in ways that embarrass and frustrate me. She has this habit of patting my behind in public, singing, "Rub it and pat it," just like she did when I was a baby. It's humiliating and inappropriate, but when I jump away and ask her to stop, she brushes it off and laughs, saying, "You used to love it when you were a baby." No matter how many times I tell her that it makes me uncomfortable now, her response is always, "You'll always be grandma's baby." She doesn't respect my boundaries, and it's gotten to the point where I dread certain interactions with her because I never know how far she'll go in treating me like a child. Things have gotten worse since I announced my pregnancy. When I told my grandparents I was expecting twins, my grandmother's reaction was intense, to say the least. She shrieked with joy, began sobbing, and immediately claimed the babies as her own. She turned to my stepmother and in a near-aggressive tone said, "Those are my babies. You hear me? Mine." My stepmother was taken aback but tried to play it off, replying, "Well, I guess I should congratulate you then." But my grandmother doubled down, saying, "They're more like my grandbabies than great-grandbabies since I raised their mother." This comment made my mom visibly uncomfortable. It was like my grandmother was completely erasing my own identity as a mother before I'd even had a chance to step into that role. As my pregnancy progressed, her possessiveness only intensified. She constantly refers to my unborn children as her babies, and it's not just in private. She says this in front of other family members. On one occasion, we were at her house with my mom when my great-aunt called to ask if I had given birth yet. Without missing a beat, my grandmother turned, pointed at my belly and said, "These are my babies," while rubbing my stomach. She even began calling herself grandma in front of my mother, who is the actual grandmother, saying, "You hear that? I'm your grandma." It's like she's trying to claim a role that isn't hers, and while my mom gets annoyed by it, I find it deeply frustrating and uncomfortable. What makes all of this even harder is how my grandmother oscillates between being overbearing and acting like she's an outcast. Sometimes, after making entitled comments about her babies, she'll switch gears and say things like, "I sure hope you'll let me see the boys at least some of the time." It's as if she's setting up this narrative where I'm the villain who might withhold my children from her, which I've never even hinted at. She'll act as though I'm planning to cut her off when, in reality, I've always intended for her to be involved in their lives. This emotional manipulation is exhausting, and it leaves me feeling guilty and resentful at the same time. It's especially hard to set boundaries with her, because I know she's been through a lot. My grandfather, who was the love of her life, passed away when I was 18, and she's been incredibly lonely ever since. They were married for 40 years, and his death hit her hard. They had always been together, and after he passed, she went from having a house filled with family and constant visitors to being alone most of the time. Before he died, we all used to visit her regularly, but now, as we've grown up, those visits have become less frequent. My cousins moved away, and my sister got a car, which meant she no longer needed my grandmother to drive her around. I know this isolation has weighed heavily on her, And part of me understands why she's so attached to the idea of my children. They represent a new source of purpose for her. She's even said that my pregnancy has given her a reason to feel needed again, and that breaks my heart. Despite feeling compassion for her, it doesn't make her behavior any easier to tolerate. My husband, who is usually very patient, has even reached his breaking point. He's watched as my grandmother has continually overstepped, and he finally confronted her during one of her more possessive moments. She was making another comment about her babies, and he calmly told her that we were the parents and would be the ones making decisions for our children. Her reaction was immediate and defensive. She distanced herself from us after that, saying she wouldn't bother us anymore. But the tension between us only grew worse. What makes this even more complicated is that my parents, who usually support me, took my grandmother's side. They said my husband had overstepped by correcting her, and I was left feeling more confused than ever. Am I being too sensitive? Is my discomfort valid? Or am I overreacting? My mom understands my frustrations, but even she can't always side with me when it comes to my grandmother. My stepdad, on the other hand, tells me to let it go and that I'm making a big deal out of nothing. This internal conflict has left me questioning myself and my feelings. Ultimately, I've decided that I need to set clear boundaries with my grandmother, even though I know it's going to be incredibly difficult. I've never been good at standing up for myself, but with my twins on the way, I realized that I have to put my foot down. I'm planning to address these boundaries at my upcoming baby shower. I'm going to make it clear that I won't tolerate anyone overstepping, whether that means showing up uninvited at the hospital or disregarding rules like no kissing the babies. I want my delivery and postpartum period to be as peaceful as possible, and I refuse to let anyone, even my grandmother, dictate how that time will go. While I still love her deeply, her behavior is driving a wedge between us. I know she's struggling with grief and loneliness, but that doesn't give her the right to claim ownership of my children or ignore my boundaries. I want her to be a part of my children's lives, but not at the cost of my mental health or the well-being of my family. Setting these boundaries is going to be tough, but it's necessary if I want to protect my new family and maintain my sanity. I only hope that, with time, she'll come to respect me not just as her granddaughter, but as an adult and a mother in my own right. After years of dealing with the little comments and gestures from my grandmother, I'd learned to tolerate them. She has a way of saying things that are possessive, especially when it comes to family and children, but I've always chalked it up to her personality and let it slide. After all, she's elderly, and in my family, we've always been taught to respect our elders, no matter what. That said, I've asked my husband numerous times not to confront her, knowing that doing so could cause an explosive situation. My family is very defensive when it comes to respecting elders, especially my grandmother, so I always felt it was better to bite my tongue than start something unnecessary. Recently, it was my mom's birthday, and the whole family went out to a restaurant to celebrate. Both sets of my grandparents were there, along with my parents and siblings. The dinner went smoothly, and we were all enjoying ourselves. My grandmother surprised everyone by paying for the entire meal, which was unexpected because she usually doesn't do that. It was a kind gesture, and I was genuinely appreciative, even though I knew that she had a way of using such gestures to position herself in a certain light, almost like it gave her more claim over us. As we were leaving the restaurant, my grandmother, with her usual overbearing demeanor, patted my stomach a couple of times and said something along the lines of, "These are my babies." I found it a bit annoying, but I've grown used to it. It wasn't a time or place to address it, especially with everyone around, and it was my mom's birthday, so I decided to let it go. However, my husband wasn't in the same frame of mind. Without hesitation, he coldly responded, "No, they're not. They're mine." His tone was sharp, and the effect was immediate. My grandmother recoiled, visibly hurt, and walked ahead of us without saying another word. The tension was palpable. To make things worse, my husband didn't say goodbye to her or even thank her for the meal she had paid for. When we got into the car, I couldn't hold back anymore, and we ended up having a huge argument about the whole situation. He claimed he hadn't realized she paid for dinner, or he would have thanked her. But more than that, he admitted he was sick and tired of her constant possessiveness over our children. He said that in the moment he just snapped. I tried to explain to him that while I understood his frustration, the way he had handled it, especially in front of everyone, was not appropriate. We talked for a long time, and I reminded him that we had already managed to curb most of her more overbearing behaviors. And while these little comments were annoying, they didn't seem like a big deal in the grand scheme of things. We both agreed that if she crossed any serious boundaries after the kids were born, we would address it calmly at that time. He promised he wouldn't react like that again, and I thought the issue was resolved. But over the next few days, my phone didn't stop ringing. Both my mom and dad were furious with my husband. My dad, in particular, was livid and even said he wanted to clobber my husband for disrespecting an elderly woman, especially one who had just paid for his meal. While I knew he wouldn't actually follow through with that, the fact that he used such strong language showed just how angry he was. He kept saying that the next time he saw my husband, he planned to give him a piece of his mind and tell him exactly how wrong he was for what he did. My mom, on the other hand, called me in tears for days after the incident, heartbroken over how mean my husband had been to her mother. She said that my grandmother had told her she now knew that we didn't want her involved in our kids' lives anymore, and that she wouldn't bother us again. It was a mess. My mom tried to explain to my grandmother that it wasn't true, and that while some of the comments she made, like calling the babies hers, weren't always well received, we didn't want her out of our lives. My grandmother, however, didn't understand why we had such an issue with it, especially since no one else in the family had ever voiced a problem with her calling grandchildren hers before. But that wasn't entirely true. My mom admitted to me that even she had been irritated by similar comments when I was born, but she had never said anything about it to my grandmother. Instead of backing me up, she just told my grandmother, just because I didn't have an issue with it doesn't mean they don't. That comment really upset me because it felt like my mom wasn't standing up for us, even though she knew firsthand how overbearing my grandmother could be. Things escalated from there. My grandmother was heartbroken, crying to my mom that she now knew her place and that she wouldn't bother us anymore. She believed that the small comments and jokes we had made in the past were proof that we didn't want her involved. She even brought up a time when my husband made a light-hearted joke about needing to put the babies on a timeshare so everyone could have time with them, saying that was another sign that we didn't want her around. It was heartbreaking to hear that she was so hurt, but it was also frustrating because her overbearing behavior had been a recurring issue, and now it felt like my husband and I were being painted as the bad guys. For 3 days, I tried to calm things down without telling my husband what was going on. I wanted to spare him the drama, but it became overwhelming. I had already talked to him about his behavior, and he felt awful, admitting that he had overreacted and wouldn't do it again. But my family wouldn't let it go. When I finally asked them why they wouldn't confront him directly if they were so upset, they said it wasn't their place. Yet, they wouldn't stop talking to me about how rude he had been. It was a constant cycle of them telling me they didn't want to stir the pot, but at the same time, they wouldn't stop dragging the situation out. When I finally told my husband about how upset my family was, he was shocked. He couldn't believe they were reacting so strongly, and while he understood why I didn't want to rock the boat, he also felt like they were blowing everything way out of proportion. I had to agree. This wasn't the first time my family had overreacted to something, and I knew from experience that they had a tendency to hold on to things for far too long. As a child, I was always expected to be perfect. Any mistake or misstep would result in punishment or humiliation, often in front of others. It was no wonder that I'd learned to tread lightly when it came to family dynamics. My husband told me he was willing to apologize to my grandmother for how he had handled things, but he still stood by what he had said. I couldn't blame him. I agreed that my grandmother's comments were crossing a line, and I told him I was sorry for how my family was behaving. I also apologized for not addressing the situation sooner and setting clearer boundaries with my grandmother. We were both on the same page, but that didn't make dealing with the aftermath any easier. Thankfully, after several days of tension, I had a long conversation with my mom. She had finally cooled down and apologized for blowing the situation out of proportion. She explained that seeing her mother and me upset had triggered her reaction, and my dad had only gotten angrier because of how upset my mom and grandmother were. She assured me that she didn't want this incident to cause a rift between our families, and she promised to talk to my grandmother and try to smooth things over. She said she would make sure my grandmother knew that we didn't hate her, but that we just needed her to tone down the possessiveness. While it was a relief to hear that my mom was willing to help resolve things, I'm still cautious about how this will all play out. I'm 34 weeks pregnant with twins, and the last thing I need is more stress. I've already decided that I won't be visiting family for a while. I need some space to focus on my own well-being and to prepare for the arrival of the babies. Hopefully, with some time and distance, the situation will calm down. But for now, I'm just trying to keep the peace and avoid any further conflict.